The night did not announce itself with chaos. It arrived quietly, almost deceptively calm, as if the waters of the Persian Gulf were holding their breath in anticipation of something that history itself had been preparing for over decades. There are moments in geopolitics that do not simply shift the balance of power, but redefine the very rules by which power operates. What unfolded in the Strait of Hormuz was not an escalation in the conventional sense. It was a revelation, a sudden, irreversible exposure of realities that had long existed beneath layers of strategic assumption, diplomatic language, and institutional confidence. For years, the Western strategic community operated under a framework that treated dominance as a constant naval superiority, particularly in constrained maritime environments, was not merely an advantage. It was an expectation. It was doctrine. It was the invisible architecture supporting every deployment, every maneuver, every show of force. And yet, in a matter of minutes, that architecture did not bend. It collapsed. 6 warships, representing not just military assets, but symbols of collective security, vanished from the operational map with a speed and finality that left no room for reinterpretation. This was not damage control. This was not a tactical withdrawal. This was erasure, the kind that forces entire institutions to confront a question they are not designed to answer quickly. What happens when the foundation you relied on no longer exists? To understand the magnitude of this moment, you have to step away from the immediate imagery of impact and destruction and instead focus on the invisible layers that made it possible. Because what occurred was not spontaneous. It was engineered. It was calculated with a level of patience and precision that only emerges from years of disciplined strategic focus. The missiles that struck their targets were not just weapons, they were the final expression of a doctrine that had been quietly maturing while the world was looking elsewhere. Long before the first launch command was issued, the battlefield had already been shaped. Surveillance systems had mapped every movement, every emission, every behavioral pattern of the vessels operating within the strait. The ships were not just being observed, they were being understood. Their rhythms, their formations, their dependencies on support systems, all of it was translated into data. And data, when processed with intent, becomes predictability. Predictability becomes vulnerability. The deployment itself, meant to signal strength, carried within it a contradiction that would only become visible in hindsight. 6 vessels in a narrow, highly monitored maritime corridor were not just projecting power, they were concentrating it. And in doing so, they created a single, coherent target environment. What was perceived as unity became exposure. What was intended as deterrence became opportunity. When the engagement window opened, it was not chosen at random. It was selected with surgical precision. A moment when defensive coordination between vessels would be strained by geography. A moment when external support would be delayed by distance. A moment when reaction time would shrink to the narrowest possible margin. In warfare, timing is not just a variable, it is a weapon. And in this case, it was used with devastating effectiveness. The missiles did not behave like a chaotic swarm. They behaved like a system. Each wave had a purpose. The initial strikes were not focused on sinking ships outright, but on blinding them, disrupting radar, overloading processing systems, forcing defensive mechanisms into a state of maximum exertion. It is a deeply unsettling realization that the first phase of destruction was not physical, but informational. Once a system loses its ability to see, to interpret, to respond coherently, its physical defenses become secondary. By the time the main waves arrived, the outcome was no longer in question. The ships were still armed. They were still technically operational. but they were no longer in control of the engagement. And in modern warfare, control is everything. Without it, even the most advanced platforms become vulnerable in ways that their designers never fully accounted for. The strikes that followed were not excessive, they were sufficient. Each impact was placed with intent, targeting the internal structures that sustain a vessel's ability to survive. Propulsion systems, power distribution networks, ammunition storage, these are not just components, they are lifelines. Once compromised, recovery becomes a race against physics itself. And physics in such scenarios rarely favors survival. What makes this moment particularly significant is not just the scale of loss, but the clarity of outcome. There is no ambiguity, no competing narratives about what might have happened. The results are measurable, undeniable, and deeply consequential. And that clarity forces a level of strategic introspection that is often avoided in more ambiguous conflicts. At the center of this transformation is the weapon system itself, not as a piece of hardware, but as a concept brought to full maturity. The missile represents a philosophy of warfare that prioritizes asymmetry, precision, and independence. It is the product of a strategic decision to invest not in parity, but in disruption, to accept that matching an adversary platform for platform is neither feasible nor necessary, and instead to develop capabilities that render those platforms ineffective. Its range, its guidance systems, its resistance to electronic interference, all of these features are not isolated advancements. They are interconnected elements of a broader design logic, a logic that asks a simple but profound question. How do you neutralize a superior force without engaging it on its own terms? The answer, as demonstrated, lies in redefining the engagement entirely. The sea-skimming approach, for instance, is not just a technical detail. It is a strategic choice. By operating at the edge of radar visibility, the missile compresses the defender's timeline. Decisions that would normally be made over minutes are forced into seconds, and in those seconds, even minor delays or uncertainties can have catastrophic consequences. It is not about overwhelming defenses in the traditional sense. It is about outpacing them. Equally important is the ability to resist and even exploit electronic countermeasures. Modern naval defense relies heavily on disrupting incoming threats through jamming and deception. But when a system is designed to interpret those disruptions as signals rather than noise, the entire defensive paradigm is inverted. What was meant to protect becomes a source of exposure. The production scale adds another layer to this reality. The ability to deploy such a volume of precision-guided munitions in a coordinated manner is not just a tactical achievement, it is an industrial one. It speaks to a level of self-sufficiency that challenges long-held assumptions about the relationship between economic constraints and military capability. It suggests that under certain conditions, limitations can drive innovation rather than suppress it. And this is where the broader implications begin to unfold. Because what has been demonstrated is not just a capability, but a model of how a state can, over time, develop the means to challenge established powers without relying on traditional pathways of military development. It is a model that will be studied, analyzed, and potentially replicated. For the alliance that suffered this loss, the challenge is not only operational, but conceptual. How do you respond to an event that exposes not just a weakness, but a gap in understanding? How do you recalibrate strategies that were built on assumptions now proven incomplete? These are not questions with immediate answers, and yet the pressure to produce those answers is immediate and intense. Internally, the strain is already visible. Different member states will interpret the event through their own lenses of risk, responsibility, and political reality. Some will call for decisive action. Others will urge caution, aware of the escalatory pathways that such action might trigger. The difficulty lies in the fact that both perspectives are valid and yet they lead in opposite directions. Externally, the perception of power has shifted, not entirely, not universally, but enough to alter calculations. Allies will seek reassurance, adversaries will seek opportunity. Neutral actors will reassess their positions in a landscape that suddenly feels less predictable. And in that reassessment, influence will be contested in new and subtle ways. The Strait of Hormuz itself, long considered a secured artery of global commerce, now carries a different meaning. It is no longer just a passage, it is a point of leverage, a place where control is not assumed but contested. And that contest will have ripple effects far beyond the immediate region. Energy markets, already sensitive to disruption, will begin to incorporate this new reality into their calculations. Risk premiums will rise, supply chains will adjust, investments will shift. These are slow processes, but they are set in motion by moments like this, moments that redefine what is considered stable and what is considered vulnerable. And then there is the question of narrative. How this event is understood, communicated, and remembered will shape its long-term impact. Narratives are not just stories. They are frameworks through which decisions are made. They influence policy, perception, and ultimately action. Competing narratives will emerge, each emphasizing different aspects, each serving different interests. But beneath all of that, there remains a core truth that is difficult to avoid. A threshold has been crossed, not in the sense of escalation alone, but in the sense of realization. The realization that power in its modern form is more fluid, more complex, and more contingent than many had assumed. That dominance in one domain does not guarantee security in another. That technological advancement is not the exclusive domain of any one group of nations. As the immediate shock begins to settle, the deeper process of analysis will take over. Institutions will review data, reconstruct timelines, identify failures, and propose adjustments. This is what they are designed to do. But the effectiveness of that process will depend on a willingness to confront uncomfortable conclusions, to question not just what went wrong, but why certain possibilities were not fully considered. Because in the end, the most significant impact of this moment may not be the loss itself, but the lessons drawn from it. Lessons about strategy, about perception, about the evolving nature of conflict. Lessons that will influence decisions long after the physical traces of this event have faded from the surface of the water. And as those lessons begin to take shape, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The world that existed before this night operated on a set of assumptions that can no longer be taken for granted. The world that follows will require a different kind of thinking, a different kind of preparation, a different understanding of what it means to project power and what it means to challenge it. The silence that followed the engagement was not empty. It was filled with the weight of that realization. The silence that followed was not the end of the event. It was the beginning of its consequences. In strategic terms, the destruction of 6 warships was only the opening move in a much larger and far more complex sequence that would unfold across political systems, economic networks, and military doctrines over the days and weeks that followed. Because once an assumption collapses, it does not simply disappear. It leaves behind a vacuum. And vacuums in geopolitics are never empty for long. Inside NATO command structures, the first phase of response was not action, but comprehension. Data streams from surviving surveillance assets, satellite feeds, fragmented communication logs, all of it was pulled into analysis centers operating under extreme time pressure. The goal was not just to confirm what had happened, but to understand how it had happened in such a decisive manner. Because every second that passed without that understanding increased the risk of miscalculation in whatever came next. But there is a fundamental difficulty in processing an event that falls outside expected parameters. Military planning frameworks are built on models, and those models are built on assumptions. When an event invalidates multiple assumptions simultaneously, the models themselves begin to fail. Analysts are forced into a position where they are not just interpreting data, but questioning the very tools they use to interpret it. And that process, by its nature, cannot be rushed without introducing further error. At the political level, the pressure was immediate and unforgiving. Governments whose vessels had been lost were now facing a dual crisis. On one side, the human reality of loss, families awaiting answers, publics demanding accountability, institutions under scrutiny. On the other side, the strategic imperative to respond in a way that restores credibility without triggering an uncontrollable escalation. These two pressures do not align easily. Emotional urgency pushes toward decisive action. Strategic caution demands restraint. The result is a form of paralysis that is rarely acknowledged openly, but is deeply felt within decision-making circles. Every available option carries risk, but the nature of those risks differs in ways that make comparison difficult. A limited response risks appearing weak, reinforcing the perception of vulnerability that the event has already created. A strong response risks escalation into a broader conflict whose boundaries cannot be clearly defined in advance. And this is where the architecture of alliances becomes both a strength and a constraint. NATO's collective decision-making process, designed to ensure unity and shared responsibility, is not optimized for rapid response under conditions of extreme divergence in national interests. Each member state enters the discussion with its own political pressures, its own economic exposures, its own historical perspectives. Achieving consensus under normal conditions is complex. Under crisis conditions, it becomes exponentially more difficult. Some governments, particularly those most directly affected by the loss, will argue for a demonstration of force, not necessarily out of aggression, but out of a perceived necessity to restore deterrence. Others, more exposed to the economic consequences of regional instability, will advocate for de-escalation and diplomatic engagement. Between these positions lies a narrow and unstable middle ground that must somehow produce a coherent strategy. While this internal debate unfolds, the external environment continues to evolve. Financial markets, often faster to react than political institutions, begin adjusting immediately. Energy prices spike not just in response to current disruption, but in anticipation of future instability. Shipping routes are reassessed. Insurance costs surge. These are not abstract shifts. They translate directly into economic pressure on governments already dealing with domestic uncertainty. The Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply passes, is no longer perceived as a guaranteed corridor. It becomes a contested space, and that change in perception alone is enough to alter global economic behavior. Even if the physical flow of energy is partially restored, the psychological impact remains. Risk, once realized, cannot be fully forgotten. In parallel, other global actors begin to position themselves within this emerging landscape. China, with its deep dependence on imported energy, faces an immediate challenge. Stability in the Gulf is not a distant concern for Beijing. It is a core economic necessity. At the same time, China's relationship with Iran provides it with a unique channel of communication that Western powers do not possess in the same way. This dual position creates both pressure and opportunity. Pressure to act in a way that protects its economic interests, opportunity to expand its influence by positioning itself as a mediator capable of engaging all sides. The decisions made in Beijing during this period will not be purely reactive. They will be strategic, calculated with an awareness that moments of crisis often open pathways that remain closed during periods of stability. Russia, observing from a different angle, interprets the situation through its own strategic lens. Disruption in global energy markets tends to produce conditions favorable to energy exporters. At the same time, the diversion of Western attention and resources toward the Gulf potentially reduces pressure in other theaters. These dynamics do not necessarily lead to direct involvement, but they shape the broader strategic environment in which decisions are made. For nations outside the traditional Western alliance structure, the event carries a different kind of significance. It is seen not just as a military engagement, but as an illustration of shifting power dynamics. The idea that a domestically developed system, built under conditions of constraint, could achieve such an outcome challenges long-standing perceptions about where advanced military capability can originate. It introduces a degree of uncertainty into global hierarchies that were previously considered relatively stable. Back within the alliance, military planners begin the process of adaptation. This is a slower, more methodical phase, less visible, but ultimately more consequential. It involves revisiting doctrines, reassessing threat models, and exploring new approaches to defense in constrained maritime environments. Questions that were once theoretical become urgent. How do you defend against saturation attacks that combine volume with precision? How do you maintain situational awareness when detection windows are reduced to seconds? How do you distribute assets in a way that reduces vulnerability without sacrificing operational effectiveness? These are not simple problems, and they do not have immediate solutions. Technological adjustments will be proposed, new systems developed, existing ones modified, but technology alone is not sufficient. There must also be a shift in mindset, a willingness to accept that previous frameworks are no longer adequate. And such shifts, particularly within large institutions, take time. Meanwhile, the concept of deterrence itself is being reevaluated. Deterrence relies on the ability to convince an adversary that the cost of action will outweigh the benefits. But when an action is carried out successfully and the expected consequences do not materialize immediately, the credibility of deterrence is called into question. Restoring that credibility is not just a matter of response. It requires a demonstration that future actions will encounter a different, more resilient set of conditions. As days pass, diplomatic channels, both public and private, begin to activate. Messages are exchanged, positions clarified, red lines communicated. This is the quieter side of crisis management, less visible but essential. It is here that the potential for de-escalation is explored, where misunderstandings are addressed, where pathways to stability are cautiously considered. Yet even as these efforts unfold, the structural changes set in motion by the event continue to develop. Energy policies are reconsidered, investments in alternative sources accelerate, supply chains are diversified. These are long-term processes, but they are driven by moments like this, moments that force a reassessment of what is considered secure. Within affected societies, the narrative begins to take shape. Media coverage, political discourse, public opinion all contribute to a collective understanding of what has occurred. This understanding will influence future policy, electoral outcomes, and national priorities. It will also shape how similar events are interpreted in the future. For the military personnel and their families, however, the strategic analysis offers little immediate comfort. Their reality is more direct, more personal. Loss is not measured in terms of capability or doctrine, but in absence. And it is a reminder that behind every strategic calculation are human lives, each one carrying its own story, its own connections, its own significance. As the situation stabilizes, at least on the surface, the deeper implications remain. The balance of power has not been completely overturned, but it has been adjusted. The margins have shifted. The confidence that once underpinned certain actions has been tempered by new awareness. And that awareness will influence decisions in ways that are not always immediately visible. The Strait of Hormuz will not remain closed indefinitely. History suggests that even the most severe disruptions eventually give way to new arrangements, new understandings, new forms of equilibrium. But the conditions under which that reopening occurs will be different. They will reflect the lessons learned, the capabilities demonstrated, the risks acknowledged. And so the story does not end with destruction. It continues with adaptation, with reassessment, with the slow, often difficult process of integrating new realities into existing systems. It is a process that unfolds over time, shaped by countless decisions, large and small. What remains constant is the fact that a line has been crossed. Not a line drawn on a map, but a line within the collective understanding of how power operates in the modern world. Crossing that line does not dictate a single outcome, but it ensures that whatever comes next will be shaped by a different set of expectations. The night that began in silence has given way to a period of noise, analysis, debate, and decision. And somewhere within that noise, the future is being constructed piece by piece by those who are able to see clearly, think critically, and act with an awareness of both risk and opportunity. Because in the end, moments like this do not just test strength, they reveal it.